here at the Chicago Council. You're all very welcome tonight. We're thrilled to have you. This is our first program of the year for our Women in Global Development program. Thanks for joining us. Just a couple of mentions of our wonderful sponsors of this program series that attracts so many people throughout the year. Our lead sponsor is Horizon Pharma. Our supporting sponsor is USG. Our patron sponsors are the Frankel Family Foundation, the Holthuis Trust, Ashley and Avery McCall. Thank you very much for your fine support and enabling us to show programs like this. For those of you who have joined us in the 2017 for our Women Global Development programs, we've got many more lined up for this year, including one around International Women's Day and also a great program with Vital Voices. Tonight's program will conclude at 6:30, and we'll be followed by a networking reception. Also, as many of you know, Louise Arbour was supposed to be here with us. She's unfortunately not able to be here tonight. However, we do have a 6-minute video from her that we'll show at the end of the live program, and then we're going to have drinks afterwards, so she will be able to be here. But if you need to leave at 6:30, that's no problem. We'll be taking questions from the audience. You can ask directly through me, or else you can do it through your smartphone. Please make sure your smartphone's on quiet, if you don't mind, please. And now let me briefly introduce our panel. Are they coming out? Oh, they're not, so I'll tell you who they are. Karen Abu Zaid has worked for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for 19 years. She has served as the regional representative for the United States and the Caribbean at UNHCR's Geneva headquarters, and as chief of mission in Sarajevo during the Bosnian War, as well as Sudan, Namibia, and Sierra Leone. Kathleen Newland was Senior Associate and Co-Director of the International Migration Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she sits on the Board of Overseers of the International Rescue Committee, USA for UNHCR, and the Foundation for the Hague Process on Migrants and Refugees, and our moderator, Juliette Sorensen. She was previously appointed to the American Bar Association's Global Anti-Corruption Task Force and the American Bar Association's Center for Human Rights Working Group on Crimes Against Humanity, and she is also the Harry R. Horrow Professor in International Law at the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. So if you please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Niamh, for framing our discussion tonight. Although I assume you're in the audience because this topic is timelier than ever. In fact, as we know, there's nothing new under the sun, and the phenomenon of refugees and migration has been going on for many years. Indeed, one set of my own great-grandparents immigrated from Denmark to Nebraska in 1880, really for a new frontier in economic opportunity. 2 years later, another set of my great-grandparents also immigrated to Nebraska, not from Denmark, but from the Ukraine, where they were fleeing pogroms and the systematic persecution of the Jewish people. That sets the stage for America today, and yet, at home and in the world, over the past 2 decades, the global population of forcibly displaced people has grown substantially, from 33.9 million in 1997 to 65.6 million in 2016, and it remains at a record high. To put this in context, since we're at the Chicago Council, a local flavor, that's 24 times the number of people who live in our city. Migrants, specifically, now make up 1/7 of the world's total population. So, although it's not new, it is irresponsible for us not to ask why. What are the drivers of these global forces, the increasing flows of migrants and refugees today? And with that, I'm going to turn to my expert colleagues on the panel here tonight. Kathleen, tell us a bit about the drivers of migration in the 21st century.
You know, I think we tend to focus very much on the negative drivers of migration, the conflicts, the human rights violations, the environmental degradation that undermines people's livelihoods, corruption, your specialty, Juliette, which gives people the feeling that no matter how hard they work, they're not going to be able to get ahead. So we think about those negative drivers of migration, but I think we also need to keep in mind the positive drivers of migration, the ambition, the desire to create a better future for one's children, to enjoy a better lifestyle. I mean, a lot of people just really want to live in a place where the electricity stays on 24 hours a day, and as do most of us. So I think they're both positive and negative drivers. The greatest number of migrants in the world, 244 million people who live outside the country where they were born, are A, legal, or they've been authorized, their movement is authorized, and are B, working. Something like 60% of all migrants are in the labor force. So while we think about drivers in this negative way, I just want to also emphasize that there are lots of positive drivers as well. The negative part is Karen's specialty.
Well, let's talk about the negative for a moment. I'm going to focus the discussion specifically on refugees and internally displaced persons. Many of the most visible mass migrations, although they are not migrants, around the world have been forced by violent conflict. Indeed, in 2016, over half the world's refugees were from just 3 countries. I'll give you 2 seconds to guess. Okay, Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. Although, of course, in recent months, the Rohingya crisis has pushed those refugees from the headlines in our 24-hour news cycle. Karen, let's talk about the Syrian conflict. In 2016, the United Nations identified 13.5 million Syrians as in need of humanitarian assistance that includes both within and without Syria. As a commissioner for the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, where are we with the Syria conflict today? And if you would put on your predictive hat, where will we be 4 years from now?
I hesitate to predict anything on Syria from 4 years or from 1 year or from 10 years. I don't know. We keep thinking and hearing that the war is winding down, that it's over. We got rid of ISIS. That's true. That's good. That's a real achievement. But the airstrikes are going on. 183 people have been killed in the last couple of weeks. Most of them, almost all of them civilians, a lot of women and children among them, so there's a lot of not such nice things going on. And this includes all sides to the conflict. The coalition, the Russian and the United States airstrikes are creating some of these problems. And what the targets often are, and these are well known when they do this, they're schools and hospitals and so on. We have the armed opposition groups, the ones who have been struggling from the beginning. They've begun to throw their shells and so on into Reef Damascus, and their allies are helping that. So there's no sign, even for example, when we hear about the people, the sieges being lifted and the people coming out, they're going out to nothing and they're taking nothing with them, and they're often in a much worse situation than when they were inside. And at first when they started evacuating people from there, many people would say, let me go back. I'd rather be bombed in my own home than in this strange place, where I have no relationships and I have no resources at all. So we're hearing that, we hope, people are talking about reconciliation. There are several peace processes going on, and that's another problem, is that they're competing with one another. There's the Sochi process that now many of the armed opposition groups particularly are saying, please don't go there. This is interfering with Geneva, it's interfering with Astana. So the 3 different trails of trying to get people together. So it's very difficult to say how long this could go on. There is so much, I would say, hatred, revenge, and so on among the groups, that it's really hard to imagine how long it will take reconciliation agreements to work and to let go. And then one other thing, the country will have to be reconstructed. The World Bank estimates that we're going to need $250 billion. Some other estimates are $400 billion to get Syria anywhere back to the wonderful country that it once was. Very tolerant, very secular, beautiful place to go, lots of crafts, lots of history, things that you would hope that it could recover again somehow.
The microphone's gone out.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry, the audio has gone out?
For all of us? Yeah.
Well, I'm just gonna raise my voice. I'm back? All right, thank you. Okay. It goes without saying that we could spend the entire discussion this evening on the Syrian conflict alone. I encourage you to think of questions and tee them up for the audience Q&A, which will come in a little while. I'm going to turn the discussion now to a point about migration and transit routes. The route across the Mediterranean Sea has been dubbed the deadliest migrant route. According to a UN study, more than 33,000 people have died attempting to cross the Mediterranean since 2000. The route has become even more dangerous as shorter and safer routes have been blocked off and longer and more perilous routes have become necessary. Kathleen, what, if anything, is the international community doing to prevent further casualties in the world's deadliest migrant route?
Well, the international community is doing a lot. There have been search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean carried out both by non-governmental organizations and by national navies and by the EU, which has a rescue force. So there have been massive rescue operations. Lots of people have been rescued, even as many others were dying. There were about 5,000 deaths recorded in 2016. Only about 3,100 in 2017, but that was on a much smaller base. Many fewer people were crossing, so the death rate was actually higher in 2017 than in 2016. Now the problem with the rescue operations has been that they make it much easier for, or have led to smugglers putting people in flimsy craft. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of these dinghies half full of water, stuffed with people 4 or 5 times their capacity, that have no hope of reaching Europe from where they set off in Libya. And the smugglers know that just outside international waters, there are rescue boats, and count on, tell migrants that they can count on being rescued. Of course, they can't always count on being rescued. But it's set up a sort of perverse dynamic where more rescue leads to more journeys. What's now happening is a much greater emphasis on return. Some 10,000 people have been returned directly from Libya to their countries of origin. The International Organization for Migration is planning to return 30,000 this year. And the government of Italy said that they will set up for the most vulnerable some direct flights from Libya to Italy so that people won't have to make the journey. It's hoped that this will undermine the smugglers' business model and create a deterrent for people to try to make this incredibly dangerous journey. One hopes that some combination of that will work.
Well, turning the locus of the discussion back across the Atlantic towards home, let's talk about the dizzying U.S. policy towards refugees and migrants for a moment. Notwithstanding the burgeoning number of refugees, the decline in U.S. admissions of refugees instituted last year by the current administration will continue this year in 2018 because President Trump's administration has instituted a cap of 45,000 refugees for this year. It's the lowest cap since Congress created the Refugee Resettlement Program in 1980. And that cap, by the way, has been set as high as 217,000 under President Reagan and was between 70 and 80,000 under both Barack Obama and George W. Bush. I'm going to pose this question to both of you and let you take potluck in terms of who wants to answer it. The first question, and that's really because these changes in policy emanating from our current White House go towards both migrants and refugees. How might these changes in policy affect the U.S. economy and our daily lives here?
I'll take a quick, short one and then turn over to Kathleen, because she lives in Washington. I think if our policy would change and be more positive toward refugees and migrants, it would be much helpful, very helpful to our economy. That's what refugees and migrants do almost anywhere they go. If they're received well, if they're integrated, given at least a work permit, if not a job, they can find that themselves, they're going to be the hardest workers you've ever seen, and they're going to contribute a lot. And it's just proven in every case where refugees and migrants have been welcomed.
Mm-hmm. Kathleen?
Yeah, the situation is actually more dire than you portray it, even, Juliet. The ceiling has never been set lower than 50,000 since 1980. It's now 45,000 for this fiscal year. But if you look at the actual rate of entry so far in this fiscal year, if that rate of entry continues, we'll be lucky to get to 20,000 admissions, which is the lowest it has been since 1980, even lower than after 9/11, when there were reasonable short-term security reasons to halt the program temporarily. But not only this, having a number that low undermines the whole infrastructure for refugee resettlement in this country. The organizations that resettle refugees are compensated primarily on a per capita basis. If only 20,000 refugees are coming in, they can't pay the rent, they can't pay their staff, and already people are being laid off in very considerable numbers. And the Trump administration has more than suggested, has said that any local office that's resettling fewer than 100 refugees should close. That's contrary to all good practice, where refugees should be distributed and, some balance between having people have a community of culturally like people and having them integrate into the broader community. They're also doing other things to undermine the infrastructure. And just one small example of this death by 1,000 cuts. There's one senior officer in the State Department who has been in charge of the refugee resettlement program for, I think, 12 years. Very experienced, knows the system, is not reflexively, he's no bleeding heart. He's not reflexively pro everything the NGOs want to do. And he's just been transferred from that job to the State Department equivalent of Siberia, which is the FOIA office in the State Department, the office that considers requests for information. This is a loss that can't easily be replaced in the short term, and it's just an example of the kind of undermining of the program that's taking place across the board.
So it sounds like the cap has been set, but in fact the actual number of refugees admitted might be far less than 45,000.
And that's not unprecedented. I mean, the cap, sure. Until the second term of the Obama administration, it was common for the cap for there to be underperformance on reaching that ceiling. The Obama administration said, reach the ceiling, do what you got to do. And so they did for the last 4 years, and indeed raised it from the 70,000 level, which had been sort of common throughout Bush, to 85 in 2016 and to 110 in 2017, which was then cut to 50 by the Trump administration for 2017, and now 45 for 2018.
Now, I asked you both how this change in policy might affect the United States. How might the change in policy affect this mass number of refugees around the world?
Well, we're going to have more of them every year. Migration has gone on forever, and it will continue to go on. It's not a phenomenon that will go away. People will still keep moving, and there'll just be more and more in places where they're not as welcome because there are too many of them. It's one of the refugee compact that's being worked out this year by the end of the year. The first paragraph of it is for reception and admission, to be sure people are received and to be admitted and received, and then to go on to get them integrated somehow. And another, just to mention what's really needed is that they go on to talk about, and this has been something that I've been talking about for the years I was with UNHCR and then even after UNRWA, to the host communities. Because refugees go to the neighboring countries. The neighboring countries are worse off than the countries from which the refugees came, and they need help too. And they are always so generous. We talk about Uganda's taken 1 million South Sudanese and given them jobs, let them have land, let them work, seen their own economy boom. I mean, it just shows what really can be done. Mm-hmm. And now I think something we're beginning to think about as well is how we could help the countries from which the refugees come to help them eventually go back. So combining all of these things to help people come out, to give those who are receiving them the hope that they will go back. But we all have to work together. It takes a great deal of international cooperation of very different kinds of governments and people.
You mentioned a moment ago the Global Compact on Refugees. I'm glad you raised it because it's the subject of my next question, along with the Global Compact on Migration. So following the unanimous adoption of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants by UN member states, including, I might note, the United States, in September 2016, 2 separate compacts were set in motion, the Global Compact for Migrants and the Global Compact for Refugees. The presentation and adoption of both compacts is expected to take place during the next UN General Assembly meeting in September of this year. To follow up on U.S. policy, late last year, the U.S. mission to the United Nations announced its withdrawal from the Migration Compact, but not the Refugee Compact. So my first question is actually as an international lawyer. The 1951 UN Refugee Convention is a binding multilateral treaty with the force of law on all nations that have adopted and ratified it, unlike these compacts. So why do we need them? Do they aim to supplement or enhance the Refugee Convention? And if so, in which way? And I'm going to ask you about your respective expertise. That is to say, Kathleen, if you could respond with regard to the Global Compact on Migration, and then Karen, the Global Compact on Refugees.
Well, as I'm sure you're all aware, the field of international migration is the least governed area of international transactions and movements. We have regimes for the movement of money. We have regimes for trade. We have a regime for refugees. But for migrants who are not refugees, there is very little international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that people have the right to leave their country, but it doesn't say they have the right to enter another one. So there's a lot of law about migrants' rights, but not about the right to migrate. Mm. And the Global Compact isn't about the right to migrate either, but it's about developing sort of common understandings and ways of operating among countries, including the countries of destination as well as the countries of origin. And I think, there's been a growing realization, despite, some countries persist in thinking that they can manage migration unilaterally. They can't, or maybe a few islands maybe can do that. But if you're not an island, it's really difficult to manage migration without some cooperation with the countries that people are coming from. So the Global Compact on Migration is meant to do 2 things: to lay out some sort of principles or at least understandings about how migration should work, and secondly, to act. To actually get some practical commitments to work together to solve some problems. And there are a lot of areas in which countries of origin and destination agree. Nobody wants people dying in the Mediterranean, to take one of the more extreme examples. But everybody agrees there should be more legal pathways for migrants. They're just different kinds, different numbers, lots of things to be worked out. But there are negotiable issues. There are lots of them. And you don't need to have 197 countries agree on them. If you get 7 or 8 countries that will work together to improve consular protection for migrants, that's something could really, it's not controversial, but it's just something that needs to be done. And I think the Global Compact could set in motion some of those actions. At least I hope so.
Yes.
Be a big disappointment if it doesn't.
Karen, during the initial consultation about these compacts, 6 themes or issues were addressed, and they included human rights, they included drivers or causes, cooperation and governance, development, smuggling and trafficking, and labor mobility. So how will structuring the compacts around these themes improve society's approach to refugee flows specifically?
Well, if they improve all of those with regard to refugees, that'll be a big boon for refugees and for the countries that are receiving them, because that's what we're talking about as well, as I said, not just the host community, but the countries themselves will be able to see the benefit and accept these. You used the word, would this be used to enhance or complement? Exactly. That's it. We have a refugee regime, but then people have to be accepted. That don't always, so that doesn't always work, but we can work on that, but it's because there is something there. But when you want to work on these other things, like how many are you going to take? So 2 kinds of things, there's responsibility sharing and burden sharing, both in the Migrant Compact and in the Refugee Compact. As you said, we can't do it alone. They can't do it alone. Can't take refugees alone, and if you're going to take them alone, you may want to, as I said, help to think about all the local communities. And that's one thing that we emphasize. Chicago's a very positive place in some of ways in terms of settlement and resettlement and the NGOs, the local people that help. And that's what you want. You can't just have the government saying, yes, we'll do it. And right now, I don't even have that. But we can have local councils, we can have local governments, we can have the NGOs themselves. You can have, I always like to use, can I use the Canadian example? They have a massive family sponsorship program. Last year, when we were having real difficulties with more and more Syrian refugees, they took 24,000 people in 2 weeks, settled them. Every refugee family that goes there is assigned to a Canadian family. The Canadian families there's a longer list of Canadian families asking to sponsor a refugee family than there are refugees coming into Canada, and there are lots coming in. And this is the kind of thing you need. You need individuals who help and then spread that joy to others of the kind of thing you're doing. You're giving people a new life.
There's a wonderful feature series in the New York Times about the Canadian families who hosted the Syrian refugee families last year. Kathleen, would you care to speculate as to why the United States announced that it was withdrawing from the Migration Compact but not the Refugee Compact?
You know, this is a real mystery to me because I was very surprised. It happened during the midst of a huge international conference that was a sort of stock-taking conference for the Global Compact. And you know, I think there was it's a mysterious decision. I would have thought that the United States, that this administration would want to be in the middle of that process, at least as a spoiler. And there were, you know, I will tell you, without naming names, that there was a little bit of relief, maybe more than a little bit, that the U.S. had pulled out. Not only because this administration could have thrown some wrenches in the works, but also because they could have encouraged some of the more recalcitrant countries to, you know, to gather round. So I'm surprised. I guess the reason is they just didn't want to lend it the legitimacy of being a nearly universally agreed consensual document. That's the only reason I can think of.
Will they come around, or this is?
I don't think they will come around in this administration. And so maybe the ideal situation is that the compact is negotiated without participation of the Trump administration, and then the next administration in 2020 will sign up.
Could I say something about
Yes.
spoiler? Just to tell you an anecdote that isn't another one about the U.S. role. I was a special advisor for the Secretary General on the summit last year on these the New York Declaration. And we started negotiating after we got our report out, which was called In Safety and Dignity. addressing large movements of refugees and migrants. So you got an idea what we thought should be discussed and what was discussed by all 193 member states. So we started discussing in June, and we know we have to finish by July 31st because ambassadors go on holiday in August. So there we are. And the only holdout is the Americans. And the Americans are holding out on the issue of detention of children. Now, our original recommendation had been children should not be detained ever.
On immigration grounds.
Huh?
On migration grounds.
Yeah. So what happened is that we diluted that in order to get the Americans on board, saying children should seldom, if ever, be detained. And we understand America has a problem about how old are children, which is different from many other countries, and so it makes it more difficult to accept these things. So 31st of July, we're still discussing this. So finally, the brilliant Irish ambassador who ran the discussions along with the Jordanian female ambassador, wonderful team, he said to the person who was sitting in the American chair, which was one of the deputy ambassadors, okay, I'll give you a chance. We have today, and if we don't do it today, I'll open everything up. If you can get one other nation to say that they will agree with you on this, I'll open up the negotiations. And he gave her half an hour, and she went round, poor thing, to every country that she could. The problem with Americans is they...
Well, in point of fact, there are many countries that do detain children. They're just not willing to put it in paper on the compact. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, they're more honest, you mean. Yeah, okay, sorry. All right. But anyway, she finally came back and whispered in the ambassador's ear, and he said, very well then, accepted, and he gavelled it at that minute. So that was the best way we got through all of that.
Well, and they haven't withdrawn from the Refugee Compact, which has that language. Okay. Another United Nations initiative, the Sustainable Development Goals, a series of broad-ranging goals related to human rights and economic development. Kathleen, in a recent policy brief that you authored called the Global Compact for Migration, How Does Development Fit In? You argue that migration is implicit in all of the Sustainable Development Goals. I was wondering if you could give me some examples and more generally speak to what initiatives the Global Compact on Migration should protect to facilitate development benefits.
Well, the Sustainable Development Goals, the framing of the Sustainable Development Goals generally is leave no one behind. So that obviously includes migrants. You know, there are 244 million people who are living outside the country of their birth, migrants and refugees, or migrants and other refugees and other migrants, as some like to say. So that's sort of the basic thing. If you want to leave no one behind, you have to include migrants. But there are also very specific elements. I mean, one of the targets in the SDGs is to facilitate, not just hope for, but facilitate, make easier, safe, orderly, and regular, by which the UN means legal, migration or authorized migration. But most of the other goals, things like, you know, achieving universal primary education, achieving universal health care, these are the people most likely to be left out are indeed refugees and other migrants, because their lives are disrupted, whether willingly or unwillingly. So I think it's just one of the fundamentals, if you're going to leave no one behind, that you have to think about migrants in all of the SDGs. But there tends to be a sort of prevailing policy stance that development is going to cure migration. And a lot of, I think, particularly donor governments think, you know, if we just step up our foreign assistance, people won't have to migrate. And it's a very unrealistic expectation, because what happens when poor countries start to get richer is that more people migrate. More people have the means to migrate. And it's not up until you get to a sort of middle income level that you see this curve starting to turn down. So I think one of the important framing issues of the SDGs is to realize that migration contributes to development, not development cures migration. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a fundamental policy rethink that I think a lot of decision makers haven't arrived at yet.
I like it. Karen, you mentioned a moment ago that Chicago is quite a positive place to resettle. As you know, cities, more often than not, are the final destination for the majority of the world's refugees. Indeed, in the United States, nearly 92% of immigrants to the United States have settled in urban areas, and by 2030, worldwide, 24% of the world's population will live in metropolitan areas. What role do cities play in ensuring that refugees and migrants are protected with access to essential services? And Mayor Rahm, I hope you're listening.
Maybe he should answer. Yeah. Well, as we say, wherever the refugees are, they're going to need support, or the migrants as well, when they first arrive, wherever they are. So you need to have good policies. And I think that we've seen there are some cities that have better policies than others, that are more welcoming than others, and provide more services, and, meeting the needs of people when they first arrive, and then thinking about how you can help them, as we keep saying, integrate somehow. Find a place, be able to take care of themselves, which is what they want to do. That's part of the reason many of them move, on the migrant side particularly, and the refugees are just desperate to make a new life for themselves in a place where they feel safe and find shelter and can move ahead.
Yeah, I think the cities are sort of the first responders to migration and refugee flows, and I think when a lot of people think of refugees, the picture that comes to mind is of a refugee camp. Refugee camps only hold about a quarter of the world's refugees. And in some of the biggest refugee hosting countries, Turkey is the largest refugee hosting country in the world currently, with about 3.5 million Syrian refugees and another 500,000 other asylum seekers, and only 10% live in camps. So, I mean, this is an urban phenomenon, and cities both have to provide those services, but they're also the beneficiaries. I mean, this tremendous economic and cultural stimulation that comes from new populations coming in, which isn't to say that there aren't problems, particularly if inclusion is not working well. A lot of the problems stem from that lack of inclusion. When you think of criminal organizations, gangs, ranging from Cosa Nostra all the way up to MS-13, were often initially a sort of protective reaction of the community that felt that it had to defend itself against an alien environment. So you can't emphasize too much the importance of inclusion and integration and making a success of it. But it's interesting to see that in most of the countries of destinations, it's the cities not only that have migrants, but that welcome migrants, that are pro-migrants. Right after the Trump administration made its decision about pulling out of the migration compact, 27 U.S. cities declared, Chicago, Los Angeles, I mean, the big ones, and Canadian cities also said, sorry, we're welcoming migrants. We are going to work together on this. We're the big population centers in this country. We're going to work on it whether the federal government is working on it or not.
Well, you mentioned
in the United States, no?
That's right. You mentioned a moment ago that development drives migration. It sounds like maybe cities have figured that out. Excuse me, that migration drives development. Migration drives cities' growth as well. Well, in conclusion, and importantly, since tonight is the first forum of the year on women and global development, I'm going to ask you both about migration and gender. And I believe that Louise Arbour, in the tape remarks that we'll hear in a moment, will refer to that as well. So it's documented that women migrants and women refugees both face a greater risk of sexual violence. trafficking, economic exploitation, and emotional trauma compared to their male counterparts. The Global Compact on Migration has incorporated a gender-aware and sensitive process in the language of the Compact, which takes into account the need to protect women and girls in vulnerable situations. Sounds good? It's a little vague. So tell us more. At a systemic level, how can emergency response systems prioritize the needs of women and girls or other vulnerable populations among migrants? And then Karen, if you want to respond on refugees as well.
Yeah, it was interesting at this big international meeting, over 1,000 delegates from almost every country except the United States in Mexico about almost exactly a month ago. There was a bit of a backlash on this idea of the vulnerability of women migrants. And many of the women's NGOs and the women themselves were saying, women are not inherently vulnerable. Women are strong. Women are incredibly resilient. They are in vulnerable situations caused by policy failures and caused by neglect. It's not that women are inherently sort of in need of protection, but policy failures cause them to be. So that's a shift of optic, I think, that needs to take hold. It's a bit different with children. I'm willing to say that children, certainly below a certain age, are inherently vulnerable. And there do need to be specific measures taken to protect them, particularly because, I mean, in Europe currently, 30% of all the asylum seekers are children, unaccompanied children. I mean, you know, that's astonishing, and I think it shows you the desperation of families both in countries beset by conflict and human rights abuses, but also countries beset by terrible poverty, that they are willing to send their children out into the world on their own to try to find safety and develop a better future. So the specific situations that endanger women need to be dealt with: the smuggling, the trafficking, and just things like the fact that, you know, in most countries, domestic workers are migrants, and domestic work is not included in labor laws. And you know, women who are working in households, in personal care and domestic work, are probably the most vulnerable migrants there are. And so there's some very straightforward correctives that need to be taken in areas like that to reduce the vulnerability of women migrants, and they need to be supported to develop their resilience and the great things they can do when they are empowered.
Anything different in the refugee context?
The compact discussions are going on. They're going on around different themes. There have been 2 sessions and then a statement by the Commissioner General of Refugees. That's not quite got to this, as far as I know anyway. What I know have come out from the other parts of the compact, but these meetings will go on up until September, quite close to September anyway, to have it ready for then. But I wouldn't be surprised, because the same issues are there: the trafficking, the smuggling, the whatever else that happens when you're on the move.
Thank you. Well, it's my pleasure now to open this discussion to our audience. I'm also going to be taking questions from the live webcast, and there are Chicago Council on Global Affairs staff in the audience. Yes, gentlemen in the back with the glasses. That's you? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And congratulations to all 3 of you. And Karen, I know you have a great reputation with women and children in Gaza, and your sympathy for them and your protection of them is incredible. Coming here tonight, too, I was just trying to think of things of what is going on in the world, but the one thing seems to be avoided, and that's religious beliefs. We see people, Hindus hating Islam, Christians against Jewish against Christians and Islam. There is so much going on there, and I think one of the things that really came to light here recently with Israel giving a state and the world community seeming to be against it, and yet God revealed that land, whether we agree or not, is theirs. He stated it 3 times. Those that bless Israel will be blessed. Those that curse Israel will be cursed. The reason why I'm saying that is one thing that is also being prophesized right now, another revelation, is that if we don't straighten this mess out, God has revealed that there's a catastrophe on its way.
Thank you.
And that the
Sir,
world...
just only in the interest of time, and because I'm
Right.
deluged with questions here, could you state the question, please?
Sure. We're all going to be in a catastrophe worse than anything that's ever hit this world. So we're all involved in the sense that we have children and grandchildren. So my question is, men have made a mess of this. Women on the forum are coming forward. Do women or men in the UN, European Union, or these negotiators of peace ever say, can we bring God into this? What has he revealed as the truth? Can we begin to negotiate and accept that? Because if we don't, we're going to treat symptoms forever, and we're going to bring the catastrophe down on all of us.
Thanks.
Have you brought it up? And if not, why not?
Please give us a chance to answer your question.
Good.
Thank you.
I actually would be happy to speak to the faith-based community in the United Nations. The United Nations has a very robust NGO community that has been explicitly incorporated into the activities of the UN since the UN Charter was signed in San Francisco in 1945, and it expressly includes the faith-based community. So there are faith-based organizations and leaders that are regularly incorporated into UN hearings and activities. Of course, they come from all around the world in a range of faiths and perspectives.
And I would say probably the most powerful statement that was made at this big international conference in December came from Pope Francis, and it was at the stock-taking conference from Pope Francis.
From Pope, yeah.
And he's been a very powerful voice for migrants and refugees. And I think that women in faith-based communities have been equally outspoken about the importance of these humanitarian issues. I think there's certainly no consensus on the apocalypse and its imminent arrival.
And certainly most of the NGOs that we're talking about are faith-based NGOs.
Many of them, indeed. Yes, lady in the gray scarf.
Sorry.
Does China take in many refugees?
No, not, and it has, the only refugees it's taken in considerable numbers are from North Korea, people who slip across the border and evade both the North Korean border guards and the Chinese border guards, who are quite inclined to send them back to North Korea. So the area abutting the North Korean border is not very porous, but people do manage to cross, and there's an ethnically similar population on the Chinese side of the border, so people do sort of mingle in that community, but China certainly doesn't have a refugee resettlement policy and has not been a place that refugees have sought to go generally.
I've received a lot of great questions via the webcast, and I'm going to ask a couple right now. First, just to follow up on the China question from an unidentified viewer, why don't we pressure Saudi Arabia or Russia to take refugees? Care to answer, either of you?
Why don't we?
Yes.
Is that what the question is? Yeah,
That's
that's a
the
good question.
Well, let me say 2 things about that. One, I'm not sure there are very many refugees who want to go to Russia. And there are some, and actually Russia has taken a great many people that they call forced migrants, who are mostly Russian nationals who have left the other former Soviet republics and have gone back to Russia. And that's been millions of people. So, one shouldn't underestimate the integration task that Russia has had after the breakup of the former Soviet Union. On Saudi Arabia, well, there's there may be a similar reluctance on the part of refugees, but it's true that with most of the Gulf states, first of all, there are a lot of Syrians in Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. These countries don't have refugee laws, they don't have refugee status, so you can't be a refugee in these countries in legal terms, but you can go there and get a job and get be able to live legally and safely. So it's not the same, and I'm not trying to excuse them. They do put a lot of money into the refugee system, and they do take a lot of people who would probably rather be students or laborers or business persons in the Gulf countries than be refugees in some other places.
You could say they do give a lot of money to the other countries too, and to the agencies that help refugees and migrants.
Yes, gentleman in the third row.
Do you know of any countries in this modern exodus of refugees that are doing labor laws correctly, that are integrating refugees in a way that makes them economically productive in their new homes?
That's a great question. Yes, there are a lot, actually. Any refugee who is accepted for resettlement or who gets asylum in a European country or in a North American country, or in most countries, anybody who gets formal refugee status is able to work. The problem is with those who are in a sort of informal status. And in many countries, the countries that are most heavily burdened with refugees, they aren't allowed to work. So Turkey has just started giving work permits to refugees. There are lots of hedges around it. It's not an easy process. Same with Jordan. And in Iran, I don't think it's even possible for Afghans to get formal work permits, or very few, only highly skilled people. But there's some progress. Turkey and Jordan have started giving some work permits to refugees and exempted some areas like agriculture from refugees having to have work permits. So in developed countries, if you're a refugee, you probably have full ability to work. In the poor countries that host the vast majority of refugees, it's less likely, but some progress is being made.
But they manage without the laws, as I think you're indicating. You think of a country like Lebanon, 4 million people, 1 million refugees, no refugee camps, and it's not great, but they're tolerated and they're there and they make their way. You mentioned Turkey, which has done a marvelous job of receiving and really providing services to the refugees without the benefit of enacting laws and so on.
I'm going to take another question now from the webcast. And it's a very interesting question. It's a question about incentivization. Can we set up a global system to reward countries that take in refugees and migrants?
It's been discussed.
And I assume that would be some type of monetary incentive?
Monetary, yes. Mm-hmm. That's what they're all trying to talk about when we say we have to help the host countries. And I'm more concerned with the communities, that really need help if they're taking refugees in or they're settling around them. But the idea is to see how we can make that a system through whichever organization, the World Bank or somebody that can organize this and supervise it to channel the money that could be coming from many countries without directing it directly to someone they really want to help, or the neighboring country or whatever, and see how you can share these things. This burden sharing and responsibility sharing is a big terms in all of these discussions.
Interesting. Yes?
I have a question specifically about burden sharing.
Wait for the mic here.
Hi, thank you both, or all three of you, so much for framing this conversation. I have a question that picks up on the concept of burden sharing. As this country starts to pull back, I'm wondering what you know or hear or understand are the received messages internationally from other countries that might consider and be thinking about growing their refugee resettlement programs. What is the message being sent? What is being perceived as we withdraw our own?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah, thank you. It's actually very consistent with a question I also received from the webcast. As the United States is pulling back and closing doors, are other countries stepping up to fill the void in different places around the world, whether that's Latin America, with regard to Latin American migrants who may be returned or removed from the United States in the future, or elsewhere?
Yeah.
Okay. I think they're mixed reactions. I mean, I think some countries are almost seeing the U.S. as sort of throwing down a gauntlet and are determined to take up the slack. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if, for example, the U.S. cuts funding to some of the refugee and migration agencies if the European countries didn't. It's not a lot of money. In the grand scheme of things, if they didn't step up to the plate. There's a tremendous amount of interest in private sponsorship of refugees, sort of on the Canadian model that Karen described. There's a pilot program in England. There is a sort of revival of some of the provincial level programs in Germany. Argentina is interested, New Zealand is interested in private sponsorship. This is where, private individuals take financial as well as sort of social and personal responsibility for resettling refugees. So, and we see in this country a tremendous outpouring from individuals and communities of a willingness to help refugees. I mean, Karen talked about how in the Canadian sponsorship program, there are more sponsors than refugees, and we're seeing that at the community level here. I know one friend of mine is a member of a congregation that decided they would sponsor a refugee family, and this is admitted by the government but helped to integrate by the community. And they called a meeting to see who wanted to help in this endeavor. And 75 people showed up, for one refugee family. So, there is a lot of will to do this, but it's not, I think in many places the people are sort of ahead of governments on this, and especially on refugee resettlement. It's a very tiny proportion of the world's refugees who get resettled. And the U.S. used to resettle more than all other countries combined. So with the U.S. really ratcheting down, there are going to be many fewer places available to resettle refugees, but it was a tiny proportion anyway, 1 or 2%. I think what's much more important is both economic support to the host countries, but also things like opening more channels for refugees to be able to get work permits, to be able to get student visas, to be able to sort of get on with their lives in ways that maybe don't amount to full resettlement, but help with their employment and their education and things like that. A lot more can be done in
I'd say, too, that if we're talking of what you want is for the refugee assisting agencies to be well funded. And so I think what happened, I was the head of UNRWA when it would come near the end of the year and we were having a deficit, as we always did. You would find that some nations would come forward to help. And it often depends on which sort of refugee you have. And so this was Arab refugees. We often got those Arab states that you think don't do so much. They would come and rescue that. And I think you see that now when you hear that the United States might take all the money away from UNRWA or get rid of it altogether, that there will be those who will come forward to help it survive.
And the overall humanitarian assistance budget, which the amount that Congress appropriated was actually higher than the amount the administration requested. And that's happened in the past as well, that administrations, the executive branch tries to cut back, but there's pretty strong bipartisan support for for humanitarian assistance. Maybe not resettlement, but over there.
I realize there are multiple questions still in the audience. We have time for exactly one more. We'll then hear the message from Ms. Arbor, but please come find all of us over a glass of wine or juice, as you prefer, at the reception afterwards. So final question, yes, sir.
You?
Yes. Thank you for waiting.
It was twofold, but hopefully you can just answer one of them. First of all, thank you for sharing your insight, and thank you for the council for hosting this. You don't see too many topics around migration, so thanks to the council for that. The twofold question was, one, in the case of the Puerto Rican, I don't know if to call them migrants or refugees, what to call the exodus that we saw after the hurricane coming here. What is your take as to how was that handled, and how different was it, given that we were dealing with American citizens coming just from the island over here? And the second one, and if you're not able to answer it right now, it's fine, is around the issue of TPS. Do other countries have such a program as that? And have you seen any program as lengthy as ours was, where we were keeping the Salvadorians and others for upwards of 17 years? And what is your take on the end of that program?
Well, I think, the situation of Puerto Ricans post-Hurricane Maria is a lot more like IDP, internally displaced people, than refugees, because they are within their own country. But of course, Puerto Rican migration to the mainland has been a very long-term process, and it's almost completely laissez-faire. I mean, there are no programs to bring Puerto Ricans here. There are no special programs for Puerto Ricans here. They are eligible for the normal social support programs, which are pretty thin, as any other American citizen. So pretty laissez-faire, and I think the reaction, the humanitarian response to Hurricane Maria has been absolutely disgraceful for the island. On the end of temporary protected status, there aren't temporary programs quite like the United States has had, which have only given status to people who are already in the country when a disaster struck their home country. There have been temporary protection programs for refugees, from the Balkans and so on in Europe, but they really were temporary. You can see the logic in the decision to end TPS based on an earthquake that happened 17 years ago. But it's a catastrophe for the people affected who've been living in this country, in the case of Salvador, for 17 years, almost 17 years. For their US-born children, what are they supposed to do? For Salvador, which 16% of their GDP comes from remittances, imagine, 16%.
They're not the only ones either.
Yeah, and you could say the same for Haiti, or so what is so irresponsible and tragic, in my view, is not ending TPS. It's ending TPS without putting something else in its place, and that is, I will say that, because the Homeland Security Department has given long lead times on the end of these programs, 18 months for the Haitians, 18 months for Salvadorans, there is time to put something in place. But, with the Congress that we have now, it's that doesn't create a great deal of confidence.
Okay. We're going to turn now to the message from Louise Arbour. Before we do that, please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.
It's my pleasure. I very much regret that I cannot
by the 1951 Refugees Convention. They number some 20 million people in the world today, an unwanted record, and by definition, demand urgent protection from the persecution that they face at home. That refugee process is being managed by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. My own focus is on those migrants numbering well over 200 million who are not refugees. They include the majority who have taken up residence in a foreign country with their paperwork fully in order, and yet who still often face many forms of discrimination, and those whose status is, for a variety of reasons, irregular, and for whom the consequences of their precarious status can be life-changing. They also encompass those people on the move, including particularly vulnerable people, most tragically epitomized in the hellish situation in which thousands find themselves, either drowning at sea or trapped in places such as Libya. In short, the reality of migration is a very far-ranging one. It encapsulates some of the most pressing humanitarian and moral dilemmas. It touches directly on notions of equality, actually too often inequality. It demands discussions of identity as communities change and evolve. It is one of the most politically contentious issues of our time. And it raises questions of huge economic significance. To give but one example, migrants send back to their home countries an average of 15% of their income, which represents more than 3 times what the world's richest states give in official development assistance. Migration is also an immutable reality. It has been with us as long as humans have existed. Indeed, demographic indicators, both population decline in some regions and growth in others, our climate, the changing nature of work, all these and other factors suggest that migration is not only here to stay, but is here to grow. It is, in short, an issue that requires a global approach, one built on cooperation and consensus, aimed at ensuring that the decision people make to move is taken freely, can be executed safely, and is for the benefit of all. The migrants themselves, of course, their community of origin, and their place of destination. The compact will be negotiated in New York over the next 6 months, building on the outcomes of several thematic and regional consultations that were held all over the world in 2017, and on a report of the UN Secretary General, which explains his vision and will be released later this week. The Global Compact for Migration will be the first intergovernmentally negotiated agreement to cover all dimensions of international migration in a comprehensive manner. It is once-in-a-generation opportunity to strengthen international cooperation in the field of migration, and I would like to share with you 3 reflections to stimulate your discussions today. First, the Global Compact should address 2 distinct, though connected, set of challenges: maximizing the benefit of migration for all, and developing a strategic response to large, mixed movements of migrants and refugees. Second, the Compact should be action-oriented and foster an era of implementation where many long-standing commitments on migration can be realized to the tangible benefit of all involved, migrants, host communities, and the people they left behind. Third, the Compact is a great opportunity to bring gender-related considerations at the heart of international cooperation around migration. We cannot afford a gender-blind compact that fails to recognize and address the different needs, vulnerabilities, capacities, and contributions of women, who constitute today some 48% of international migrants. I wish you all a very successful meeting, and I look forward to hearing about the outcomes of your discussions today. Thank you very much.
Well, Well, thank you to Her Excellency. And now please join us for a drink. I think that the chairs will be cleared out and it'll be a chance to talk further.